Education Support is the mental health and wellbeing charity for everyone working in education. My name is Sinead McBrearty, and I'm the Chief Executive of the charity, which is a dream job. I'm very pleased and delighted to be doing it. I've got a couple of things to say at the outset. We have put this event on in response to teachers getting in touch with us after the television program Adolescence. There are some of you I know who have shared that it is frustrating that it takes a television program to bring an issue into the spotlight. And I know that we have, through our helpline and through the work that we do with schools, been talking to education staff for years about the issues that we're going to focus on today. But it is also really good to have the provocation to make time and space for the conversation. And thank you to those of you who've asked us to put this webinar on. We always try and respond to the requests that education staff make for content and support. And so here we are doing this today. I'll just say at the outset, the purpose of this conversation is really for us to explore the challenges that go with navigating misogynistic behaviour in schools. And I think that we're coming to this with curiosity and with compassion. That's the way in which we want to have this conversation. We also recognise that there will be people who are joining the call who will have had difficult experiences. And some of you may have had really difficult experiences or be aware of other colleagues who have. So I also want to set out, and my colleague Jen will, I'm sure, add this to the chat, that the Education Support Helpline, which is 08000 562 561, is open 24 hours a day. And for anyone, I'm not saying, if you've had a difficult experience, you must leave this webinar. That is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that if the conversation in this webinar brings up feelings that are difficult, if it puts you in a place where you're reminded of things, or you need to have a chat with somebody to process something that's happened, that is why our helpline is there. That is what we live for. And so please make use of that service if that can be helpful to you, or to share that number with colleagues. That is the helpline for the workforce. So I just wanted to draw that to everybody's attention at the beginning, and I'm sure that we will repeat it throughout this event. Right, let me move on and introduce this fantastic panel of speakers to you. So I'm delighted to say that we've got Kyra McHugh, who is a primary school classroom teacher, dialing in not quite from the beach in Worthing, but from the coast nonetheless, not that I'm jealous. And she is an early career teacher. She has got a lot to share with us about her experiences on this topic. And we're just really delighted to have somebody with that perspective joining today. So Kyra, thank you. I'm also pleased to welcome my friend Manny Botway. Manny, can I call you my friend? I feel like I can now.
You're more than welcome to. Yeah, of course.
And Manny is the president of the Association of School and College Leaders and is a head teacher in Macclesfield. Although a native South Londoner, we in South London miss him. He has gone north, though we've forgiven him for moving up the country, where he now lives and has done for 10 years. So Manny, really delighted to hear from you. I know you're here both bringing a leadership perspective, but really importantly, bringing a secondary setting perspective on the issues that we're talking about today. And finally, delighted to welcome Jamie Bale from Beyond Equality, who are our partner organisation for this webinar. Jamie has had a variety of roles in project management and across social change, but he has come to this work around perspectives on masculinities, and he's been working with schools on this since 2021. And we're just so privileged to be able to have this experience in the room, because part of what Jamie is doing day to day is having conversations with boys about their experience, and in a way that is inquiring and listening and making a space to hear and understand. And so in that spirit of curiosity that I talked about, I'm really delighted to be able to hear that perspective today. So colleagues, to everybody who's on the call, The normal pattern of this is we start, it's very conversational. This isn't a formal presentation kind of event. We will have a conversation about the issues as they arise. But we really welcome your questions. So if there's something that you want to know about, if there's some burning issue for you that's brought you to this conversation today, please type a question into the Q&A and I'll do my best to get to those as they come, and deal with as many as we can, depending on what the volume is. But please participate. We want to respond to why you're here. So let us know and we'll target the conversation in that way. But first of all, Jamie, let me come to you just at the opening. You know, I was reading today about the fact that almost 40% of secondary school teachers are, experiencing misogyny or seeing misogyny in the school place every week. That's not an annual figure. That's a weekly figure. We know from our own research that the experience of this in the classroom has escalated a lot over the last 8, 9 years. But you are there in schools talking to young people. Just as an opening kind of gambit, would you say a little bit about where are our young people in relation to masculinity, misogyny? What are you hearing?
Wow. So we started with the small themes. Okay.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, young people are clearly in a moment of high tension, as are non-young people. So I think, they are a reflection of the world that we all live in. But I think specifically for young people, what we hear in the classrooms and the conversations that we have with young people, in our case specifically boys and young men, is a moment of tension. It's a moment of being overwhelmed. It's a moment of awareness of just how polarized a lot of things are, or at least that is as how it's packaged when it reaches their senses, their eyes, their ears, and I suppose they're in a moment in which feeling of safety is not really immediate to them. So it raises very logically a great sense of unrest. So I think that's where our young people are at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie, for that. And Kyra, you're in a primary setting, and I know, having been a safeguarding governor in a primary school, until fairly recently, this wasn't really on the agenda in primary schools. But what's your experience now?
I mean, obviously, as you said, I'm an ECT, so I've only been in school for 2 years. I think, obviously, being a significantly younger teacher than most of my colleagues as well, I do have a little bit of a stronger, almost inside knowledge of what's going on in terms of social media and what's going on online. And a lot of what I see in primary school is those harmful online narratives being used in a way that children don't understand. It's a lot of just referencing things they've seen on different social media platforms, or perhaps from older siblings, and using them in ways that they really do not understand how harmful they are. But what we're starting to see now, as we come towards the end of Key Stage 2, the children are understanding what they're saying and the impact it's having on others. So that's something that, as a school, we are working on, how to implement different strategies into our policies on how to best support them in actually being prepared to move to secondary school, where this is going to become a much more of a problem. I work in year 4, so at the moment it's a lot of what you would expect from primary age children. So deliberately leaving children out of certain things, name calling. Those are the kinds of things that are typical in primary school anyway, and things that we work on. But we are finding a lot more now, because of what children are seeing from their outside world and the influence they're having from the people around them at home, is that is becoming a lot more severe, and we are having to collaborate a lot more with parents to try and get them on board of what we are doing in school. But again, due to the demands of the curriculum, it is quite tough to move our RHE lessons more into focusing on these problems that are actually happening for them at the moment. So that is something that, again, we are looking at, and we're trying to deal with it as it comes, really.
Yeah. And just for you as an early career teacher, are you in your second year?
Yeah.
Right. So for you, as someone at that early point in their career, how much of your headspace or emotional capacity does this take up? How much of your bandwidth goes on this at the moment?
Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, both school-based and personally as well. it's, I mean, I've got a sibling that's 12 years old too, so it's very close to home. And obviously dealing with it at school, it does take up a lot of space. And I prioritise these problems in our school. And as I just said, at the moment, we are trying to work on actually having scheduled times to be able to talk to the children about these problems. But I just think as they come up, for me personally, I like to deal with them straight away. And obviously in primary, we do, just speaking to secondary colleagues, we do have a lot more communication with parents daily. I mean, I see the parents morning and afternoon. And actually what it really takes is having those difficult conversations with parents and really getting them to understand the severity of what they may see as a off the cuff comment from a child. Actually, it goes a lot deeper than that. So yeah, it really does take its toll. It's also that fine balance of, there are some children that, as I just said, do understand exactly what they're saying and doing, but then you've got a large majority of children that don't. So it's having that fine line of, do we address this to all of them before it becomes an issue, or do we just speak to this one child? That is sometimes quite a lot, in terms of class size and additional adults that you've got around you, which is sometimes, really stretched. So yeah, I would say it takes up a lot of headspace. Yeah.
Thanks a million, Kyra. Thank you for that. Mani, in a secondary setting then, tell me what's it like? What's going on for staff? What's the experience?
Yeah, I start off by saying that, look, I'm very lucky. I work in, fabulous school, and as are most schools across the country, they're great places. But I think if you talk to school leaders and teachers and staff on the ground, they will say that they're picking up a lot of the sort of issues that have already been discussed. So we are hearing from our primary colleagues, and we see this with our year seven, that they're much, much more likely to have been exposed to pornography, had vast amounts of time unsupervised in the virtual world, be engaged in gaming environments where misogynistic, racist, and homophobic language is the norm. Um, the sorts of things that we would say are manifesting themselves in terms of how young people have relationships is the access to porn. And that is now kind of, you see that in terms of how young people interact, how they view relationships, expectations in terms of quote unquote beauty standards, etc., etc. But also the impact of the political world and the political landscape. So, we're in an era where, politics is far more polarized, and there are people in positions of power who are saying things that, pretty overtly, that maybe we would not have heard politicians say a generation ago. And that's kind of emboldening more youngsters to say things that we would regard as being beyond the pale. And kind of against that landscape is that, there are different contexts which exist across the country and in different parts of the world. So what does it mean to live in particular areas? How does this intersect with a number of different other areas such as race, class? So there's a lot that young people are kind of unpicking. But yeah, lots of the kind of things that have been talked about, they are things that I imagine are a feature of all schools in the UK and across the Western world today.
Well, Manny, that's a very systemic perspective, I think, on the issues. And I think you rightly point to, well, I'm not going to mince my words here. I was going to try and be polite, but the paucity of leadership politically, the poverty of equality that we see in that discourse is really depressing. And it can't be surprising to us to see that our young people, respond to that, I guess. But you also draw attention there to profit-seeking businesses, whether that's the porn industry or whether it's the gaming industry, and the limits on violence and discrimination in those industries seem to be wholly uncapped. and our young people's access. Again, I speak as a parent here. When I've made conversation is probably the wrong way to put it, but anyway, when I've spoken to other parents about this, the awareness of parents is really through the floor in terms of what they imagine their kids are doing when they're in their rooms on devices. We might come back to this, but and finally, just the importance of what you say about intersectionality, because of course none of this happens in a vacuum, and there is, I think, a really important point to be discussed around the experience of our boys and young men and young women and girls of color, in how some of those industries have also exercised extraordinary levels of discrimination, and how they have peddled stereotypes and really opened a whole other level of discourse that seems to me to merit its own consideration. But anyway, thank you for that. I think setting that context is hugely important. Jamie, I want to come to you, and I think there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about. One was, I just wanted to get your take from your professional perspective on if there are people on this call who are thinking, I'm not quite sure always if this is misogynistic or isn't, or how should I don't want to overreact, or how would I know that this is something to be concerned about, or how would I raise something if I feel concerned about it? Is there anything you would say to people about that, about any of the patterns of behavior, or anything they might want to notice that may not even be particularly overt?
I suppose, particularly when it comes to a term like misogyny, which at the moment has been, we've seen a real kind of the last couple of months, obviously, in the kind of, post-adolescence being released, a lot more kind of discourse around it, a lot more use of terminology like online misogyny, like word misogyny, like lots of things. I first of all, to any people, whether it's parents, carers, whether it's teachers, the first port of call would be to say, hang on, does it matter whether it is misogyny, whether it's racism, whether it's whatever? Let's say, is there a harm that we can perceive as being done? Then in that case, we need to find systems in which we can have conversations with young people involved, whether that is young people perpetrating harm, whether it is young people on the receiving end of harm. And very quickly, going back to that intersectionality that Manny has already mentioned, as soon as we have those conversations with the young people, we'll see those intersections, and we'll see where the misogyny comes in. We'll see where the systemic racism may come in. So I think it's very, very important for us to kind of think about that notion of harm, where, why, and to who it's happening, and also who's carrying it out. I think that will be the kind of prime thing. And I think the one thing when it comes to young people, in our case, particularly in terms of the school program that we have at Beyond Equality, when we go into schools and we hold these workshops with boys specifically, it is really to go into that room acknowledging that all of those boys that come into our sessions, every single session, every single boy has an interaction with harm. They have an awareness of harm. They have an awareness that harm is going on. So when we go in empathetically, knowing that there will be a part of their experience that has experienced harm as them being the one on the receiving end of harm, even when that might then have spurred from harm that they've done, but that they will have an experience of it. And that is the key to really having empathetic. If we go into that conversation with them knowing that they have experienced harm, we've got an in that we can give to them to go, I understand that you've had that harm, therefore let's see where we can build, where that sits in the community that you already have, in our case, 20 people that you're sharing the room in. How does that sit when you go out of this room, in your school, in your classroom, in your set, in your tutor group? And then we can take it beyond the school and how that fits largely in their community, in their family, whatever it may be. So that would be my kind of first thing to say to all people is kind of we have to acknowledge just how widespread the experience of harm is at the moment in everybody's world, right? And that is the in for us to find that similarity that can help us solve some of the differences.
There's so much wisdom in there. I think the strategy, also the really specific kind of heuristic you give there around where, why, to whom, by whom, really helpful to think that through. And that can sort of help us, because sometimes I think we can end up in a situation and have a response internally, and it can be difficult to think when you are having a lot of feeling because something might have triggered some feelings in you yourself. So that's a really helpful way to think about it, but also just what you're describing in terms of how you work in your work with young people. There's so much in there that's about humanizing experience and coming back to relationships. And I think if we know anything is valuable and important in this discourse, it is about humanizing and relating. So really important and really helpful to hear that, and the empathy that you are talking about. I'm going to come to Kyra and Manny and just ask you in a moment about any practical tips or strategies that you've seen used in schools or with groups of children and young people. And I will come back then after that to Jamie as well. But before I do, I just want to come to Richard in the chat. Richard, you've made a point there about the change in the expectations of young people's place in society. I'm going to ask you if you would just add a bit of specificity to that in the chat so we can really focus that question in on the right area that you want to talk about. But so if you would do that, and then I will come back and pick up some of the other comments in the chat. But Kyra, do you have any tips, insights, strategies that you would share that you've seen or been around?
Yeah, I think just going off on what Jamie said about teaching that empathy, obviously for us down in primary, we are teaching them a lot of the social skills that they require to be able to handle different situations. And I mean, I was actually talking with a colleague about it not too long ago. It's actually quite interesting. You know, they come up with these, they have different situations on the playground or between friends, and they deal with it the best way they know how. And that's why it's really important for us to actually allocate that time to teach them how to empathise towards each other. And I liked how you just said humanise it, because the more we give them those concrete examples of how their behaviour affects another person, the more likely they are to correct it. It's also a lot of what we do at the school that I'm at is modelling that language that we want each other to be using and addressing things as soon as they happen. I think what's really important among schools is obviously having a really strong reporting system. Our children are very, very clear on the behaviour expectations, and when they do fall out of line of it, and what we're having a lot in terms of language, in terms of misogyny, which they are not as aware of, they're not clear on the terminology down in primary as much. But we just have to address it as soon as it happens, because it is new to them. They don't quite understand what they're saying and doing. So we're kind of just adding to our behaviour policy as each day goes on. But yeah, really modelling that inclusive language among one another and coming up with a lot of scenario-based learning. So getting them to actually problem solve situations together, right? How would we handle this? And if there's ever anything that I personally am unsure on how to sanction or how to follow up correctly, I will always go to another member of staff that I trust and get them to kind of unpick it with me. But I would only do that after I've spoken to the child about it. I think also what's really difficult in primary is there is a lot of, he said, she said. So it takes us quite a while sometimes to get to the bottom of what's actually happened. But it is much more beneficial that if there is a situation that you have the children deal with it with you to teach them how to deal with it next time. But I think that it all comes down to that language, really modelling the language and behaviours that you want to see in the children, because they are watching you all day, every day.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Manny, in terms of what you see and what you consider good practice in schools around this, what might you share?
I mean, in terms of what we do at my school, we won't be particularly unusual to it, but having been through the process and going through the process, we feel like culturally it's made a difference in the school. So, for us, a kind of probably watershed moment was the you may recall that everyone is invited movement, really. And there was an Ofsted report that followed, which highlighted the scale of sexual abuse in schools, and in response to that, we kind of took a number of different measures in school. which we feel has made a difference. Look, there's still a way to go, but we feel it's made a difference. I mean, first and foremost, we kind of moved towards a much more explicit, what we call it, personal development curriculum. And yeah, prior to that, we had a series of kind of drop down days and assemblies, etc., etc. And it was good stuff, but I don't think it was intentional enough. And now we have, you know, a fabulous head of personal development, and she is responsible for overseeing the taught curriculum, and it's taught by specialists, and curriculum time is given over. And part of the reason for doing that is that one of the problems that we were facing is that if an issue emerged in the local community or something was of interest in the news, we didn't feel that the curriculum was suitably agile enough to tackle that straight on in lessons, you know, there and then. So actually creating time in the curriculum for this was an absolute essential for us. And it is now one of the most popular subjects, I would say, and it's taught from year 7 right the way through to year 13. So everybody has that entitlement. And that is also part of our kind of formal quality assurance process. So it's taught in the same way that history, geography, maths, and English is. Our assemblies are very much kind of, you know, they always focus on our core values, but we'll routinely revisit, you know, misogyny and racism in particular. So quite very recently, we picked up, there was a member of staff who'd sort of fed back and sort of said, okay, she was picking up some issues with some year 10 lads. And that kind of triggered a whole chain of events, one of which culminated in a session for those particular, you know, for year 10, but also being quite public in terms of our expectations in terms of conduct. And that those assemblies are really important to us because we think that they are they make it quite clear what our expectations are, and it sounds pretty basic, but actually I think it's really important that these behaviours or ways of acting are actually called out. They're officially kind of called out as unacceptable. And sometimes we think that we've done that, but we haven't. But it also provides us with an opportunity to showcase staff role models. So the assemblies are often what we try to get staff who are leading the assemblies. We try to get them to be quite vulnerable in public. You know, so, you know, recent assembly I gave was around this idea of masks and a public mask and what's behind the mask. We will have members, you know, we have members of staff who are openly gay who will give assemblies about their experience. You know, we'll have members of staff who talk about their experiences of sexism or racism, and that has an impact. But in practical terms, you know, we monitor it. We now officially code misogyny within our behaviour systems, and there's there's a reporting system that comes out from that. The curriculum enables us to kind of formally define and discuss the issue, because I do think there are times when young people are using language which, you know, has become normalized and they're not quite aware of, look, are you aware of the kind of the origins of this language, or are you aware of the harm that it causes to other people? And the other thing, and lastly, student voice has been a really big thing. So gathering the thoughts of students, and that's been really influential in terms of how we approach teaching, our personal development. I think what students want to engage in, you know, certainly the feedback that we've got is they want to engage in what we would call as the messy middle. So I think for understandable reasons, if I take an issue such as relationships or a topic such as relationships, sometimes the temptation is to present the extreme. So either an obviously perfect relationship or an obviously dysfunctional relationship. actually what people want to know is they want to kind of get involved in the middle. They want a discussion where there might be some disagreement around kind of, is this healthy? Is this not healthy? What do you think? Why do you think that? And that's been really important. And the last thing I'll mention, and then I promise I will shut up, is that in the aftermath of everyone's inviting, this is purely organic. It wasn't something that we set up. The group of students who came together and formed a women's group, which is a group of it's a cross-age group of female students. And what's been really interesting is the topics that they campaign on. So they were raising money for a local domestic abuse charity. And these are issues that we just don't touch upon in school. And that's driven by the young women in the school. They have a leader, they have a staff representative who kind of, lead sessions, but they're involved in kind of gender pay gap and, policing, policy. And I think that kind of student voice and that activism has a place to play in this. So yeah, sorry if I've rambled there, but
No.
there are a list of sorts of things that we've done in our school.
I find myself very moved by the breadth of what's being held there in that school community of yours, Manny. I'm going to digest that. I'm going to, Jamie, come to you and with two things really. And let me just interject in myself to say, for anyone who's worried about, yes, there is a recording. There will be a recording of this, just so you know. Jamie, the two things. One is Richard's put a really helpful addition there about his point about changing expectations over the last quarter century. And the other point is this one that's come up both as a question in the chat and just now. So let me start with that first, which is strategies to address and modify, if I use your language, instead of saying misogynistic language, if I say harmful language. But in terms of strategies to challenge harmful language or harmful stereotypes, if you're talking to somebody who's working in a school who doesn't have the opportunity to sit and have a long connection with a young person, are there any more immediate strategies that they may be able to use in a 5-minute interaction that would be helpful for them to have up their sleeve? Is my number one. And then no pressure, Jamie, I'm coming back to you for your reflections on the 25 years of change in expectations. On you go.
Thank you. I'll see what I can do. I'd immediately go to Kyra's point from before. I think that there is a lot to be gained from modeling the behavior and the expectations that we maybe put, or that schools and put upon the young people that live in that school. And often it's one of the things that in our sessions, a lot of the boys that we work with bring up very quickly in some schools that there tend to be lots of expectations. There are lots of schools that have their school way, or there will be some kind of anagram that is on the walls all about the school. And immediately the boys will say, yeah, that's great, but it's not the way that we're treated by the people telling us to behave like that. So there is so much in that modeling, and it's been really kind of, it's warmed my heart to hear both from Kyra and from Manny's perspective of how that is developing in the schools. And my experience of the schools is the same. We go into many schools that are really putting their all and going above and beyond, which we could have a long conversation about whether teachers should have to go above and beyond and how sustainable that might be. But there are lots of schools doing that. At the same time, there are lots of schools that currently aren't. And rarely is that through choice, but through a real limitation in maybe the resources they have, some real challenges that they may be in front of. But I think that is the most powerful thing, how much you can model. And also, even if it's in 5 minutes, being able to either reflect back or give the young person a chance to explain themselves. So if it's an example of using harmful language, having a second to ask them to explain what they mean by that. even that sounds really simple, and even if the answer that you come back doesn't feel genuine, which it may a lot of the time when we're talking to young people. Kyra made a reference to much younger children going he said she said. I'm sure Manny can speak to many 15 and 16-year-olds that still go down the he said she said. But just like reflecting what they've just said back to them and asking them, what did you mean by that? What was your intention when you used that? Is really valuable, because I think the amount of times when in our sessions, because that is our role, is to reflect back what's been said, to ask for further clarity. Often there is a moment of silence that comes from the young person that is a moment of realization when you actually ask them, so why did you do that? Because every single young person that we ask, in our case, when we're talking about masculinities and men, there's a very big difference in us asking the question of, what should a man be like? And we'll get a bunch of answers from some teenage boys. And when we ask the boys, what do you think makes a good man? Those two lists look extremely different. So when we ask young people what they think would make a good man, they make really wise choices that make what be an absolutely utopic world. But then it's very different. Like, how should a man be in 2025? There's a lot more contrast. There's a lot more conflict in those pictures. So these young people do know what makes a good world. The conflict comes in them not understanding why that isn't accessible. Why are we not seeing that reflected when the world got, we've got the breadth of the internet in which we can see many wonderful things of how things should be. It's very difficult for a young person to understand why that isn't happening.
Yeah, it's really, really important. And very moving, that idea that those two lists are so, different. And this is, I think we had a pre-conversation before this event, and we were all very clear about not, this is not about blaming boys. I feel like the boys and men are in a dynamic with bigger actors, and it comes out in that example that of course people do have choices, but choices aren't always very immediate or very available, and I think it takes a lot for us to stand in their shoes and see the world from that perspective. Let me come back to the changing expectations. So look, I turn 50 later this week, so half my lifetime ago Richard started teaching. And I can confirm the world was a different place. We viewed men and women differently. The conversation about gender was rather different. In some ways, well, I'm not going to pass judgment on that. But Jamie, what's your view on the changing expectations and where our boys and young men are with that?
This is the starting point of our sessions. So once we've opened up and created a little bit of a space in which we kind of make an agreement with the boys about how they would like to be treated, how they would like to treat each other. We're very open and clear that we will have conversations about topics that we disagree on. We will be using language that maybe they wouldn't normally use in a class, or maybe there would be repercussions, which there won't be in our sessions. We start with that. We start with those conversations around what are the expectations on men, on boys. What is the expectation? What does society tell you that, in terms of how you should behave, what your expectations are? And obviously every single group of young people that we have together will have their own unique qualities. There's a moment that they are their own little culture of 20 people in the room with us. But there are clear through lines, and there are expectations on men that are fed to them of having to be the best, having to be strong, having to be dominant, having to provide, having to protect. And I think the most important thing to talk about with them is to see how they view those expectations, what a positive version of those expectations are, and what a negative version of those expectations is. And I go back to Manny's point about the middle bit. Very quickly, they have access to the extreme versions, the best possible version and the worst possible version, but the reality is somewhere in the middle, and that's the place that is most interesting for them. So the reality is that they're in a moment where the most important quality to them when we talk about relationships, we talk about, what are the qualities that you think make a healthy relationship? The term that we have the deepest conversations about is trust. That is what they see as the basis for all healthy relationships, for something that makes them feel safe. And if we go back to the beginning when you asked me about how young people are feeling, safety doesn't seem to be a feeling that most young people are currently sharing, and that brings in trust. So if they really want trust, they really recognize what trust is, but they don't see it. There's a really telling moment in terms of how we see the influence of sex and porn turning up for young people, which is we do this kind of game called the OPCON, which is going back and forth of agree or disagree with a statement, and we make a bunch of statements about who would you be comfortable talking about sex and relationships with parents or carers or with teachers or with people you don't know or online or not online. And one of the things we ask is about trusting the internet, the online world as a source for information, and young people all say that it is somewhere that they understand is not trustworthy. It's not a place to get your information, or at least you can guarantee that, that information is worthy and it is going to be safe. They all say that. They know that. We then a bit later on in the workshop have a conversation around sex. What comes to mind first? What are their ideas around sex? And all the terminology comes online. A lot of it, as Manny said, is heavily influenced by porn. And we can then say to them, hang on, if you're telling us that you definitely know that the online world isn't 100% safe, isn't 100% trustworthy, but we can also show you that this is where you're getting all the information, there is there's something there that's a big discord. So I think that inherently makes them feel that trust is really hard to reach, because if it's uncomfortable to have a conversation with a teacher, if it's uncomfortable to have a conversation with the adult world, if they're not having as many places where they are sharing space with their peers, at least in the real world, they're more comfortable talking with them online, even if they're people that they know in the real world. And anyone that you don't know that you contact in the online world is definitely not trustworthy. Then where is the trustworthy space? So it's a really difficult place. So providing spaces where they can talk about these things is really, really, it's key to them feeling as if there is somewhere where they can unpick what is trustworthy and what isn't.
There's so much in that, and I can't help feeling as a parent watching my teenage boys engaging in the world. The online world is like Lord of the Flies. It is not. It is. I mean, really, it is not safe. I really can see why that would be a loud theme that would come out of your work. And yet it's the space they're in. It's where life is lived, and that's a really problematic setup. And I guess at one level, I feel like this is where socially we have let our young people down in a way in terms of what they are exposed to and the extent of it. But that's probably not for this conversation. But I can't help myself but begin to step onto that soapbox. But look, I'm stepping back. I'm going to zip it because this is not my webinar. And Kyra, I'm going to come to you and ask you, and then I'll follow up with the same question actually to Manny. There's so much good conversation in the chat. Anyone who's a participant who hasn't clocked it, there's loads on there and we can't reflect it all back. So, but just take it in as you go. But one of the things that comes through there is the role of parents. And I guess I'm very struck by many things to do with parents because it's in a lot of our work at the moment. But there is a way in which parents can reinforce problematic power dynamics when education staff seek to speak to them about issues that have come up in school. Kyra, how, with your almost 2 full years of teaching under your belt, what have you seen in parent relationships that you think, yeah, this is good, actually, this is a good way to deal with parents. I think this is helpful. I'm going to do this again. What have you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely in my first year had a lot of very difficult interactions with parents. A lot of it almost being used against me that I was younger and that I was in my first year of teaching. And yeah, I mean, that was a mixture both between mothers and fathers from their children, very much questioning my ability to even say their child had done something wrong, or even just try to suggest something to them. What I am finding more this year is that obviously I'm a lot more confident in myself, and I mean, I've got a great team around me as well. I'm very, very fortunate to have that. More parents are on board than not, but I mean, typically in my school anyway, we have quite a lot of anxious parents. And what's quite interesting, the year group that I teach, year 4, now this cohort were just beginning early years when COVID hit, and their social interactions are absolutely insane. We are still teaching them, you know, the very basics on how to interact with each other, and their parents are very, very involved, which is great. I think what we do have is that denial side from the parents when we do speak to them about whether their child has been using sexual language or has behaved in a certain way that's utterly inappropriate. They immediately see it as, oh, it's, you know, it's harmless. They probably didn't mean it like that. And that's a lot of what we hear. Oh, they probably didn't mean it like that. And we, you know, we have to put our foot down and say, okay, they may not have meant it like that, but there's that very small percent chance they could have. And even if they didn't, another child may have understood what they were doing in a different way. Yeah, I think from my perspective, the parents are quite positive. They want to be involved. We at the start of the year group, start of this academic year, in every year group, we do a parent meeting. And like what Jamie said earlier about, you know, going above and beyond and questioning whether we should do that. It is a lot at the start of the year. We plug quite a lot into the parents, and more so in the past couple of years, regarding social media and our usage and the effect it can have on their children, the world that they're exposed to. And actually, a lot of parents have absolutely no idea what their children can access when they're left alone with a device. And it really is quite scary. It really is shocking what they can access and the kind of things they're exposed to at such a young age, and how devices are, it makes them drawn towards it, the way that certain things are advertised and plugged into their world. Of course they're going to be able to access things. So we do a whole assembly per year group for parents, basically teaching them how to set parental controls. What we have more in primary school is that the lack of understanding in how they can set controls on their devices, and that's something we got back as feedback from parents. So we were like, okay, very simple solution, we'll teach them how to do it. And we've all got different perspectives. It's really great. A lot of members of staff obviously got their own children, and more so what I found quite useful this year to be able to give my input is I'm only 22, still using social media quite a lot. So being able to actually say, oh, actually, no, I wouldn't advise that, but I would advise this. So actually having that hands-on examples of ways that we can protect the children from seeing certain things. But of course, what's difficult is those children that are disadvantaged and their parents aren't engaged with what we're trying to give at school. Those are the children we want there, and those are the parents that we want there, and they're not there. So that is something that's really hard, but it's just being persistent and just trying. I am seeing the parents every day. So where I can, where possible, it's always speaking to them verbally. I try and avoid phone calls and emails because there's always that miscommunication. And, if I can speak to them face to face, I always will. And we're always never in a space by ourselves, which I found really helpful as well in our school. I'm never allowed to have a conversation with a parent without another member of staff around. I learnt my lesson in my first year to not do that. Learned it the hard way. It is all about that community and that support from other members of staff as well, actually being able to jump in if something isn't quite going a way that you'd expect it to, and preempting if there is a difficult conversation, a particularly difficult situation that's happened in the day. I'll always have another member of staff there just in case to deliver that with me. I hope that helps.
Very much so, Kyra. I'm sorry that it was a hard-won lesson to have a colleague around, and I'm glad that you're able to have a colleague around. I think what I take from that is just in how you are describing that, one of the things that I know is very important to parents is it doesn't come across as judgmental. You're talking about what's complex in the environment, but you're not saying, good, bad, or indifferent in terms of how parents are parenting. And I know that that's really important to parents and can be something that has a big effect on them. But also you're making an offer, proactively offering to help with parental controls. Again, I'm quite a fascist in my house. My poor kids, you know, honestly, they feel like they're growing up in the 1960s. But the number of parents who don't understand parental controls, or who kind of puts them on and then they just disintegrate. Or as my kids told me, one kid had parental controls and he was trying to stream something and he'd show a friend. He went, hang on, let me just put the parental lock in. And the kids were like, why do you know the code? And he said, well, my mom told me just in case I got stuck with the phone, I should have it. And you're like, you know, it's extraordinary. So being able to offer something proactive and valuable to parents feels like a really important piece of this as well. Manny, you have your own experience, which is very rich in the community that you're in, and you also hear from across the country different things that are going on. What's your view on how we can most constructively in the sector engage with parents here?
I mean, you know, lots of the points that Kyra has made, absolutely spot on in terms of, you know, keeping that open relationship. I mean, different school leaders have their own different styles. I mean, for me, as I said, I've generally as a leader, I've always been quite vulnerable and quite honest about leadership in school. And my own children go through secondary school, and so I think the school community, you know, not so great for my daughters, but in terms of leadership, I've always shared the kind of challenges that come with that. And I think I don't know whether or not it's just a mellowing as a kind of school leader as I sort of age, or whether or not there's a genuine impact as I see my own children kind of go through the system. But I think that point about not being judgmental is really important. And understanding the challenges that come with being a parent, and also just acknowledging the challenges, you know. So look, I'm not the world's greatest parent, you know, I'm all right, but I wouldn't win any awards. But acknowledging that is really important. You come back home, you've had a, you know, really busy day, you're tired. You start off life as a parent imagining that your own children are going to be reading Shakespeare from the age of, you know, 3 or 4, and then life kicks in. You're knackered, you're tired, and it requires quite a bit of energy to kind of say, right, my teenager, right, you got to do your homework, right, you got to come off the phone, you got to do this, you got to do that. And there's also a great deal of pressure for a lot of parents, in terms of, you know, just that sheer kind of, you know, wanting to make sure that your child is kind of involved in every single, you know, activity going. You know, they've got to be culturally kind of engaged, and, you know, and that brings its own pressure. And I think sometimes we just have to acknowledge that that is a reality and that is a pressure. And that can sometimes just take the temperature down in terms of saying, look, I get it, I understand it, it's hard. But, you know, as leaders within the community, as the adults within the community, we've got to create an environment that allows young people to thrive. And I think that's really quite important. I think for me on this issue of kind of, you know, parenting, and just more widely community within our local area is that I think one of the great differences in the last kind of 30 to 40 years is the kind of retreat of what I would call kind of community institutions or social institutions, whether they're youth clubs or sporting clubs or churches and charities or pubs or nightclubs. You know, many of the areas where we would have socialized and learnt from people who were maybe a bit different, maybe a bit older, they're now gone. And many of the local authorities that used to offer school support in those areas have now gone. So I think, you know, as difficult and as challenging as that is for leaders and people involved in education, we have to kind of navigate that new terrain. So, you know, when you were talking earlier about kind of those conversations and where they happen, well, actually, we are now the only place in the community where that happens. So we've got to create part of the rationale for sort of saying, look, we've got to give proper curriculum time to this is where else are youngsters going to learn to have a debate or a discussion where they disagree that doesn't lead to some sort of either physical altercation or some sort of social media kind of battle? If we don't do it, there just is nowhere else for that to happen. Um, but I think in terms of parent, I think just articulating, narrating what you're doing, showing that you're human, showing that you're on their side, that look, there'll be times where we disagree, but actually we all want the same thing. We want your child to do well and thrive. I think they're really important. And 99% of parents, it might not always feel like this, but they want it to work for us. It's just the challenges that come with the circumstance of being a parent. Sometimes it's tough. You know, sometimes the responses that we get are as a result of somebody who's had a really, really tough and awful day, and when we're on the phone, it just hasn't quite worked. But trying to keep that hope is really important.
Yeah. You definitely drank some profound tea earlier, Manny. You've really hit some spots today. Jamie, I'm going to come to you for the last word. I'll give you a minute well, I'll just flag. I'm going to ask you from your work, is there anything else that has come up through your work, through some of those safe spaces with boys that you think we need to hear and really know? And that's going to be your last word for this. And I know you've already shared a lot, but if there's anything additional that you want to add. And I'm going to just say to my colleague Jen, if you are circulating a feedback link to colleagues, then do that now. And if you're not, don't. That's grand as well. But I'm going to give see there, Jen Havel's just asking you to give some feedback, and then we can make sure that these things learn anything we need to learn. Thanks, Jen. I'm going to give the last word to Jamie. Jamie, what else do we need to hear?
I don't think it's anything else. I think it's continuing the things that we've heard already today and going straight from Manny's point about being, schools being the place where these conversations happen now. We know what's happened in terms of, the reduction of spaces, whether it's youth clubs, whether it is what actually even sports clubs represent. They represent something very different. They're no longer community. They serve a purpose in terms of the kids. There's lots of kind of places where young people don't have that community sense. So therefore, what can we do in schools? I just repeat what I hear. I can see a particular boy in my mind right now, but the one of the most common things we hear at the end of our workshops is boys saying, "This was great. Can it be an after school club? Can it be something that we do next week? Are you coming back again?" So really kind of emphasizing the value in creating those spaces where young people can unpick things, when they can unpick things without the feeling of consequence literally kind of being above their heads, being able to go in that middle ground, being able to, maybe look a little bit separately where they have maybe not been up to the standard of expectations that the school has and the society that they're in has put in front of them, but not feel that that means that it's going to have a negative impact on them immediately, but actually have a space for them to unpick it, to explore it, to feel, and to really ask why that happened. What is the feeling that's going on that has made this thing happen? And put that confidence in the young people. The young people, I'll go back to what I said, young people do know what it takes to have a good world. What they can't visualize yet is how we can make that happen. And that in the education sector, that's our job. We're supposed to make that path, those scaffolding, whatever you want to call it, we're supposed to make that visible to them so that they can access it.
Thank you, Jamie. And I want to thank everybody who has attended this event, because you've come here because you're wanting to hear and learn and think about these issues. And that just speaks to the phenomenal professionalism, passion, compassion, empathy that we see up and down the sector. And with my 14-year-old and my 12-year-old, I see this all the time. I see how difficult it is to parent, and how in the absence of extended families and communities and institutions that used to exist, as Manny described, it really can be very lonely. So what you do in school, whether you do it in a formal way, whether you have the space that is, as some of the best practice we've heard here today is, or whether you were just one teacher who's doing your best to have decent conversations with people and be human and be connecting and not judge, you are making the world a better place. So Thank you for all that you do.